This police canine dog's final sacrifice left an entire town in tears. When a child disappears in a deadly snowstorm, an aging police dog is the only one who can find him. Pushing through the freezing night, Buddy tracks the boy, refusing to stop despite the brutal cold. As the town waits in fear, the storm rages on, threatening to bury all hope. With time slipping away, will Buddy's determination be enough to bring the child home alive? The wind screamed through the small mountain town, tearing at rooftops and battering against the thick blanket of snow that had already swallowed the roads. Power lines sagged under the weight of ice, and the streetlights flickered weakly, struggling to stay lit against the storm's fury. The blizzard had arrived without mercy, turning the once picturesque landscape into a treacherous white abyss. Inside the tiny sheriff's station, the air was thick with tension. Mary Dawson clutched the front of her coat, her knuckles pale from the pressure. Her breaths came sharp and uneven, fogging the glass in front of her as she stared out into the swirling chaos. "My son is out there," she managed, her voice brittle, almost breaking under the weight of those words. "Tommy, he wandered into the woods. He's only 6. He doesn't know how to find his way back." Officer Lucas Turner, still pulling on his heavy-duty jacket, turned to face her. His expression was calm, focused, but beneath the surface, urgency pressed against his ribs. "How long has he been gone?" "An hour, maybe more." Lucas exchanged a glance with Deputy Harris, who stood by the radio, adjusting the volume as static crackled through. The snowstorm had already disrupted communication with nearby towns. "That's long enough to be dangerous," Harris muttered. Mary wiped at her damp cheeks with a sleeve of her coat. "Please, you have to find him. I know I should have been watching closer, but he loves the snow." He didn't understand how bad it was getting. Lucas nodded and reached for his radio. "This is Turner. I'm deploying with Buddy for search and rescue. Need all available units on standby." Harris frowned. "Lucas, it's getting worse by the minute. Search teams are saying visibility is nearly zero. If we send people out there blind..." "We don't have time to wait," Lucas interrupted. His tone wasn't sharp, but it left no room for argument. "A kid that young won't last long in this cold." Harris sighed, shaking his head. "We'll do what we can from here. Just be careful." Lucas turned on his heel and headed for the kennels, where his partner was already alert, ears pricked, body tense. Buddy, a sturdy German shepherd with thick winter-ready fur, watched him intently, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "We've got a job to do, pal," Lucas murmured, fastening the dog's harness. "Let's bring that boy home." Outside, the wind tore through Lucas's coat the moment he stepped onto the snow-packed ground. Buddy stayed close at his side, his paws pressing firm prints into the fresh drifts. The snow swallowed sound, muffling everything except the low roar of the storm. At the edge of the forest, Mary pointed with a shaking hand. "He went that way. I called for him, but..." She broke off, her breath hitching. He didn't answer. Lucas crouched beside Buddy and ran a gloved hand along his back. "Find him, boy." Buddy sniffed at the snow, his nose twitching as he caught a faint trace of something beneath the ice and wind. His ears flicked forward, muscles coiling with determination. Then he surged ahead, leading the way into the storm. Lucas followed without hesitation, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. The trees loomed around them, skeletal and stripped bare by winter's grip. Snow clung to the branches, weighing them down until they drooped under the strain. Every few steps, Lucas called Tommy's name, but the wind snatched his voice and flung it into the night. The deeper they went, the more the storm swallowed the world around them. There was no town anymore, no houses with glowing windows, only the vast emptiness of the mountain and the howling wind. The search team had hesitated, and Lucas knew why. Out here, the cold wasn't just cold, it was something alive, pressing against skin and seeping into bone. Buddy pressed on, his tail straight, his focus unshaken. Lucas trusted him. He had to, because somewhere out there, a little boy was waiting to be found. Lucas tightened his grip on the flashlight, though its beam barely cut through the storm. Snow slashed sideways, stinging his exposed skin and settling in thick layers over his shoulders. The trees, already burdened by the blizzard, swayed under the force of the wind, their branches groaning as if they might snap at any moment. Beside him, Buddy moved forward with steady determination, his body low, ears pinned back against the cold. Lucas could barely see more than a few feet ahead, but he trusted the dog's instincts. If anyone could find Tommy out here, it was Buddy. The search and rescue team had set up a perimeter closer to town, their voices crackling over the radio, but the storm was working against them. Visibility was nearly non-existent, and the deeper Lucas moved into the forest, the harder it became to tell one path from another. Still, Buddy pressed on, his nose working through the frozen air, searching for any trace of the lost child. A fresh gust of wind sent a spray of ice into Lucas's face, and he pulled his scarf higher, shielding himself from the bitter cold. He glanced at his watch. Tommy had been missing for hours now. Every minute that passed, the boy's chances of survival shrank. Buddy suddenly stopped, his body tense. He sniffed the ground, then lifted his head, nostrils flaring as he caught something beneath the layers of snow and ice. Lucas crouched beside him, heart hammering in his chest. "You got something, boy?" Buddy didn't wait for a command. He veered sharply to the right, nose down, tracking. His paws kicked up powdery snow as he moved with renewed purpose. Lucas followed, his breath coming in harsh bursts as he struggled to keep up. The wind howled, drowning out every other sound. Trees crowded together, their trunks forming dark pillars in the storm. Lucas kept his focus on Buddy, his only guide in the swirling white void. Then, just as quickly as Buddy had picked up the scent, he faltered. The snow was deep here, undisturbed except for their footprints. Whatever trail Buddy had caught was fading. Lucas's stomach tightened. "Come on, Buddy. Keep looking." The German shepherd circled, sniffing the air, moving back and forth in tight patterns. Then, with a low huff, he turned sharply and took off again, his movements more urgent. Lucas followed, his boots crunching through the hardened layers of snow. The cold was relentless. Ice clung to his lashes, his fingers numbed despite the gloves. Buddy's pace slowed slightly, and Lucas could see the effort it took for the dog to push forward. His thick coat was coated in frost, his breath heavy in the freezing air. Lucas reached for his radio. "Turner here. Buddy's on a scent. We're moving northeast past the tree line." Static answered him. He adjusted the frequency, trying again. "Does anyone copy?" Nothing. The storm had cut them off. Buddy barked suddenly, the sharp sound slicing through the wind. He dug at the snow with both front paws, sending chunks flying behind him. Lucas's pulse jumped. He hurried forward and crouched beside the dog. "What is it?" Before he could get a closer look, a deep rumble shook the ground beneath them. It was distant at first, like the shifting of ice far away, but then it grew, rolling through the earth with a force that made Lucas's breath catch. Avalanche. The sound exploded through the valley, an unstoppable wall of snow and debris roaring down the mountainside. Lucas's instincts screamed at him to move, but the avalanche was coming fast, tearing through trees, swallowing everything in its path. "Buddy, go." The dog bolted ahead, and Lucas followed, lungs burning as he pushed himself forward. The wind shifted, carrying a deafening rush of snow behind them. Lucas barely had time to register the shifting landscape before the ground beneath him pitched sideways. The force of the avalanche sent him sprawling, his body slamming hard against the frozen earth. Ice and snow crashed around him, filling the air with blinding white. He scrambled to his feet, blinking against the onslaught. Buddy was ahead, shaking himself free from the snow. He let out a sharp bark and turned, waiting for Lucas to catch up. Lucas forced his way forward, his legs burning from the effort. The avalanche had changed everything. The path ahead was buried, the landscape unfamiliar. The search would be even harder now. Buddy stood alert, ears forward, his body trembling, but ready to keep going. Lucas wiped snow from his face and took a steadying breath. They weren't giving up. Not now. He gave Buddy a firm nod. "Find him." The dog sniffed the air again, searching for that faint, buried scent. Then he started moving, his paws pressing into the fresh snow, his determination unshaken. Lucas followed, pushing forward into the storm. Buddy's paws sank deep into the freshly fallen snow, his breath forming quick puffs in the freezing air. The avalanche had changed everything. The landscape no longer looked the same, paths buried under thick layers of ice and debris. But the dog didn't hesitate. He sniffed, pressed forward, then stopped suddenly, ears pricked. Lucas followed, his boots crunching through the snow. His fingers were stiff, the cold gnawing at them, even through his gloves. The flashlight barely cut through the darkness, its beam bouncing weakly off the swirling snowflakes. Buddy let out a sharp bark, then began digging frantically at a spot beneath a gnarled tree. His front legs worked fast, sending sprays of ice and powder behind him. Lucas dropped to his knees, brushing the snow aside with his gloved hands. The cold bit into his skin, but he didn't stop. Then, beneath the layers of white, a flash of color. Lucas's breath hitched. Tommy. The boy lay curled up, barely visible under the thick blanket of snow. His tiny frame was motionless, his face pale, his lips tinged blue. Ice clung to his eyelashes, his small hands stiff where they rested against his chest. Lucas pressed his fingers against Tommy's neck, searching for a pulse. The moment stretched, every second an eternity. Then, faint, sluggish but there, still alive. He exhaled, the relief almost dizzying. "I got you, kid." Lucas pulled off his glove and pressed his palm against Tommy's cheek. Ice cold. The boy needed warmth, fast. He reached for his radio. "Turner here. I found him. Need med. Static. Nothing but dead air." The storm had swallowed their signal. Lucas clenched his jaw. He had no way of calling for help. No backup coming anytime soon. And Tommy wasn't just cold. He was barely holding on. Buddy gave a low whine and stepped closer, pressing his thick-furred body against the child. Instinct. He knew what needed to be done. Without hesitation, the dog curled around Tommy, covering him as best he could with his warm coat. Lucas tugged off his outer jacket and draped it over both of them, sealing in as much heat as possible. He rubbed Tommy's arms, trying to get any sign of movement. "Come on, buddy. You're not done yet." The boy's eyelids fluttered, but his body remained still. Too weak. Too cold. Lucas's mind raced. Carrying Tommy back through the storm would take time. Too much time. If they stopped moving, the cold would win. But Buddy was a furnace. His body heat a lifeline in the freezing dark. Lucas pressed his hand against Tommy's forehead, feeling the warmth starting to seep back into his skin. Not enough yet, but something. He scooted in closer, shielding them both as the wind howled through the trees. They would have to wait, just long enough for Tommy to regain enough strength for the journey back. Buddy didn't move. He stayed curled around the boy, steady and strong, the only warmth in the frozen wilderness. Lucas fumbled with the lighter, his hands raw from the cold. He struck the flint again and again, but the wind swallowed the tiny sparks before they could catch. The pile of twigs he had gathered lay useless, covered in frost. He cupped his hands around the small flame that flickered to life for a brief moment, only to die as another gust of wind cut through the trees. His breath came in slow, heavy clouds, the bitter air biting at his lungs. Buddy remained where he was, curled tightly around Tommy, shielding the boy with his thick coat. Snow clung to the dog's fur, forming icy patches along his back. He didn't move. His dark eyes stayed locked on the child, his body a barrier against the relentless cold. Lucas's mind raced for another solution, but there was none. They were too far from town, too deep into the storm. His radio was still dead. The only thing he could do was wait for someone to find them, or for the storm to pass. He huddled closer, wrapping his arms around Tommy's fragile frame. The boy's skin felt slightly warmer than before, but not warm enough. Time dragged on, marked only by the endless wind and the weight of snow piling around them. Lucas tried to keep track of the hours, but the storm blurred everything together. He focused instead on Buddy. The dog hadn't shifted an inch. He stayed wrapped around Tommy, his own body taking the worst of the cold. His breathing had slowed, each exhale less visible in the freezing air. His fur, once thick and insulating, was coated in a layer of ice. Lucas reached out, running a hand over Buddy's side. He was trembling, not shivering, trembling. Lucas felt a sharp stab of fear. Buddy was strong, but even he had limits. The cold was draining him, stealing his warmth inch by inch. Still, the dog refused to move. His heartbeat thudded against Tommy's back, his breath warm against the boy's cheek. He was keeping him alive. Lucas unzipped his own jacket, pulling it tighter around them. His body ached, his own warmth fading, but he ignored it. He pressed his forehead against Buddy's, feeling the frost stiff in his fur. "Hang in there, boy," he muttered, voice hoarse. "Help's coming." He had no way of knowing if that was true. Minutes passed. Hours. The wind never stopped. Buddy's breathing grew shallower, his shivers weaker. Lucas could see it now. The cost of his loyalty. The dog would not move, would not save himself. He had chosen Tommy first. Lucas felt his throat tighten. He knew he should pull Buddy away, force him to stand, to shake the ice from his coat. But how could he? The boy needed him, and Buddy would not leave, even if it meant his own body gave out first. Lucas pressed his hand to Buddy's chest, feeling the slowing rhythm beneath the frozen fur. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. They couldn't afford to lose him. Not now. Not after everything. He adjusted his position, pressing his own body closer to Buddy's side, willing whatever heat he had left into the dog. He rubbed his hands along Buddy's fur, trying to stir warmth back into him. "Stay with me," he murmured. "Just a little longer." Buddy's ear twitched. A small movement, but a movement nonetheless. Lucas took it as a sign. They just had to hold on. The storm raged on, and still, Buddy did not move from Tommy's side. The first light of dawn barely pierced through the heavy clouds, but the wind had eased, leaving behind an eerie silence. Snow lay thick and undisturbed, a frozen world untouched by time. Then, in the distance, the low hum of approaching engines cut through the quiet. The rescue team was coming. Lucas barely registered the sound at first. His body was numb, his mind sluggish from the endless cold. He had long since stopped feeling his fingers, but he still kept them pressed against Tommy's back, holding on to whatever warmth remained. Buddy had not moved. His thick fur, once a barrier against the cold, was now stiff with ice. Still, he stayed curled around the boy, shielding him, even now. A sharp voice rang through the trees. "We found them. Over here." Heavy boots crunched through the snow, the sound drawing closer. Flashlights cut through the early morning dimness, beams dancing over the frozen landscape. Lucas barely had the strength to lift his head, but relief crashed over him in a slow, almost dreamlike wave. They had made it. Gloved hands reached for Tommy first. A rescuer knelt beside them, brushing the snow from the boy's face. "He's alive," the man confirmed, voice tight with urgency. Another team member unfurled a thermal blanket, wrapping it carefully around Tommy's small frame. The boy stirred slightly, a faint, barely there, sound escaping his lips. Lucas exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Tommy was alive. They had made it through the night. He turned his attention to Buddy. The dog hadn't lifted his head, hadn't moved since the rescuers arrived. His body remained curved protectively around the child, as if even in rest, he refused to let go. Lucas reached out, shaking him gently. "Buddy." Nothing. A hollow dread settled in Lucas's chest. He shook him again, harder this time. "Come on, boy. Wake up." No response. Lucas pressed his hand against Buddy's side. There was no rise and fall beneath his palm, no steady rhythm of breath. The dog's fur, still covered in frost, was unnaturally still. A lump formed in Lucas's throat, thick and unyielding. One of the rescuers crouched beside him. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. He must have. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Lucas's vision blurred. He placed a hand on Buddy's head, his fingers brushing over the frozen fur. The dog had given everything, his warmth, his strength, his very last breath, to keep Tommy alive. Even in death, he remained where he was needed most. The team worked quickly, loading Tommy onto a stretcher, wrapping him in layers of insulation. Lucas barely heard them. His focus remained on Buddy. He ran a trembling hand down the dog's side, his mind grasping for something, anything, to make this feel less real. A soft touch on his shoulder pulled him back. "We need to move," one of the rescuers said gently. "The storm could pick back up." Lucas nodded numbly. He reached down, arms wrapping around Buddy's lifeless body. He refused to leave him behind. The dog who had saved them all deserved more than that. As the team made their way through the snow, Lucas carried Buddy close, his grip firm, his heart heavy. The sky above was lightening, the promise of morning creeping through the storm's remnants. But for Lucas, the world felt dimmer. Buddy had been more than a partner, more than just a dog. He had been family, and now he was gone.